I sat on the floor of my empty apartment in Boston and stared at the ring in its velvet box. 2 weeks ago my wedding dress had been hanging here, and there had been a guest list on the refrigerator. Stephen had returned the ring and said I was too ordinary for his new life. And he left. Just like that. So ruthlessly. I lost him, my home, myself. Everything. A letter from the agency arrived at night. Personal assistant wanted. Confidential. High pay. I didn't even think, I just packed my bag and left. I wanted to disappear so that no one would know how far I had fallen. The mansion stood on a granite cliff like a ship stuck on land. Tall windows, dark columns, the roar of the ocean. At the entrance I was met by the manager, Arthur Carroll, dry, attentive as if he could read my suitcases. The owner's office was like something from another time. Oak paneling, floor-to-ceiling windows, the sea beyond them gray and angry. Jonathan Hayes, a former financial genius, now in a wheelchair. His gray eyes looked straight through me. The job is only simple on paper. Schedules, medications, security, he said. Can you handle it? I have a reason to try, I replied. Reasons are better than promises, he remarked. I was assigned to the East Wing. The house led a double life. The rustling of papers during the day and no caller ID calls and footsteps in the hallways at night. I quickly figured out the routine. Medication on a schedule, mail in 2 piles, calls only through an encrypted channel. I tried to observe more than I asked questions. During the first storm, financier Brenner arrived. He talked about a soft takeover and a clean reputation, while Jonathan calmly parried. You're offering me to sell my name. Too cheap. Sometimes the price is the moment, Brenner smiled. You're wrong. Storms last the longest, Jonathan replied. Later, passing by the library, I noticed a photograph. Jonathan, a woman, a teenager. The glass was cracked. Arthur, catching my gaze, said quietly, "Every house has forbidden rooms. Sometimes they hang on the wall." The alarm went off at night. Without thinking, I went down to the old greenhouse. A tiny B2 key lay on the floor. Behind me, I heard the soft rustle of wheels. Is curiosity a driving force or a trap? Jonathan asked. It depends on what for, I replied, turning to him. He showed me the server room. Cold, green lights, printouts marked buyback, and blacklist. Too often those I trusted let me down, Jonathan said. But sometimes you have to share the burden. Our eyes met, not by accident but as a test. For the first time in a long time I took a deep breath. I'll stay, I said. Right now it makes more sense than anything that's happened to me in years, he said after a pause. When we got up, the storm had subsided. Jonathan handed me a blanket by the fireplace, his fingers barely touching my hand. He looked at the sea and said, "The sea and people are alike. Calm on the surface until you go deeper. And the sea also returns what has been lost. Just not always in the same form," I replied. The house by the sea knew how to keep secrets. But maybe tonight it chose our side. From early morning, the house smelled of wet wood and salt. I woke up before my alarm clock because the ocean was beating against the glass with a low rhythm like a heartbeat, and there was something alarming about that rhythm. My first days working at the mansion were tense. I was getting used to the schedule, the manager's tone, Jonathan's gray eyes that seemed to see right through me. He was strict and demanding, but there was a system to his strictness, not cruelty. I caught myself beginning to feel calm when I heard his voice from his office. I tried to stay in the shadows, but the longer I was here, the more I realized that the house was not just a decoration. It breathed and told me where to tread carefully. There was a steady hum under the stairs, as if there were pipes or servers living there. The greenhouse, which I had stumbled into on my first night, smelled of wet earth and metal, and the lamps gave off a soft light, like a street lamp in the fog. With each passing day I saw Jonathan come to life. He became less distant, sometimes initiating conversations himself, taking an interest in my habits, asking about my family. There was something in his voice that made me want to listen. The unhurried confidence of a man who had been through too much to waste words. I understood that behind the cold armor was a tired but intelligent and lively person who simply no longer trusted anyone. Gradually the job ceased to feel like just a duty. I learned his routes, his habits, even his moods. If he stared out the window longer than usual, it meant he was waiting for a call. If he fiddled with the blanket, it meant he was thinking about a decision he wasn't ready to make. I could sense his inner struggle and couldn't help but admire how he held himself together. Sometimes in the evenings when the house was quiet, I would sit in the library with a notebook and take notes. Not only about medications or phone calls, but also about the people who came to visit. Strangers' names and dates, fragments of phrases, intonations. It all came together in a map that I didn't yet know how to read. Memories of Stephen came back less and less often. But I began to see his name in folders, in letters, in codes. He was part of a network that was trying to finish Jonathan off. It mixed the past and the present, making me an unwitting participant in a game whose stakes I could hardly imagine. I caught myself thinking of Jonathan as more than just my employer. His calmness was reassuring, his presence was magnetic. Sometimes he would talk about the books he had read before the accident or the cities he had visited, and in those moments he seemed to come back to life. I listened and felt that his words opened up a whole world that I wanted to enter. One morning I brought him coffee to his office. He was focused, his hair slightly tousled, the light from the window softening his face. He didn't notice me come in, and for the first time he looked not like the master of the house, but like a man who was both tired and strong. I put down the cup and quietly left, but a strange warmth remained in my chest for a long time, the feeling that I was not just an assistant. At night the storm returned. The light of the sea lights pierced through the fog and the house groaned in the wind. Under the stairs, it hummed louder than usual. I stood in the hallway and felt that something was changing, approaching. Everything that had happened before, Stephen, the wedding, the escape, seemed like preparation for this strange big story that I had entered without knowing the rules. I lay down in bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The wind was blowing outside the door, and behind the wall, perhaps, sat a man I was beginning to trust. The thought was both frightening and comforting. I didn't know how this game would end, but for the first time in a long time I didn't want to run away. Only a week had passed, but it felt like I had been living in this house for months. I knew how each step of the staircase creaked, how the sound of the ocean changed with the tide, and how Jonathan's mood shifted with the changing tides. In the morning I greeted the dawn with a cup of coffee on the terrace and watched the fog creep over the cliff, wrapping the mansion in a gray blanket. Now this place no longer felt foreign to me, but rather like a strange yet safe cocoon that we shared together. Every day Jonathan talked to me longer. He rarely smiled, but sometimes there was a barely audible hint of warmth in his voice. He told me how he was obsessed with his business, how friends turned into enemies and trust turned into a web. "I thought I was controlling people," he said once, "but it turned out they were controlling me." There was bitterness in his words, but also steely determination. I helped him with his correspondence, met guests and sorted documents. More and more often, the same names that had surfaced in my past life with Stephen appeared in letters and phone calls. I began to understand that I had gotten caught up in the heart of the conflict. But that no longer frightened me. On the contrary, I felt that I had to stay. Sometimes we had lunch together in the library to avoid prying eyes. He talked about the books he was rereading and the trips he dreamed of taking. I listened, and a palpable silence fell between us. Not an awkward one, but a trusting one. I felt something shifting, growing inside me like water under ice. I started bringing coffee to his office in the mornings. He drank it without sugar, with a drop of milk. At first he didn't notice, then he thanked me with a short nod, then he began to linger his gaze. And each time that gaze was a little longer, a little warmer than before. Strange things were still happening in the house. In the evenings, Arthur Carroll checked the locks, as if he were expecting guests rather than afraid of them. The humming under the stairs grew louder. Sometimes I heard the server racks clicking downstairs. The house was breathing and I could already guess its rhythm. One evening, as I was closing the curtains in his study, Jonathan suddenly said, "When you entered this house it seemed to come alive. Before that it was a prison." I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there holding the heavy fabric in my hands. "Sometimes it seems to me," he continued, "that the storm outside is weaker than the storm inside me." I turned to him and saw something in his eyes that made me want to come closer. It wasn't pity or fear, it was recognition. I felt a strange courage. I leaned over and adjusted the blanket on his shoulders. A common gesture, but between us it turned out to be something more. His fingers barely touched my hand and I didn't pull away. The world outside swayed, but at that point of contact there was an amazing calm. I couldn't sleep that night. It seemed to me that everything around me had changed. The walls, the sound of the ocean, the air. I stared at the ceiling and felt that if I left tomorrow, I would regret it for the rest of my life. If I stayed, I would enter a story that could destroy me or rebuild me. I went out onto the balcony and breathed in the night air. The ocean smelled of salt and something coppery like blood. Below, the dim lights of the security guards were burning. The wind carried the hum of the server room. It all seemed like a scene where the actors don't yet know how it will end. Returning to my room, I wrote in my notebook, "I'm not just an assistant here. I'm a witness. And maybe someone he will confide in." And for the first time I signed my name not mechanically but with conviction. That same night I had a dream. I was walking along a stone path to the sea and Jonathan was holding my hand. We were both silent, but that silence was warmer than any campfire. I woke up with my heart beating as if it had just been touched. Ever since I first entered the server room, something in the house seemed to have shifted. I increasingly found myself feeling that I was being watched. Not by Jonathan or Arthur but by a third person who knew my every move. During the day everything seemed normal. Tea on a tray, phone calls, documents, routine tasks. But at night, the hum of the server room under the stairs became insistent, like a pulse. I noticed that the letters addressed to Jonathan were becoming more alarming. First, dry legal notices, then short threats disguised as business proposals. Agreement in force. Your signature is required. Terms changed, each time from different senders but in the same style. I understood. This was a game of cat and mouse and we were being cornered. Arthur Carroll began to appear less often, his steps in the corridor more cautious. Once he said quietly to me, "Something is moving outside that cannot be stopped with words. Be careful." His gaze lingered on me as if he wanted to say more but couldn't. Jonathan remained composed as always. But I saw how he clenched his fingers when he read new letters, how he stayed by the window longer than usual, staring at the gray line of the horizon. In his office there was a map of the coastline, dotted with marks, and now he added new ones from time to time. Stephen reminded me of himself again. His name popped up in the reports I was sorting through. He worked through Morrow Capital, the very fund that was trying to swallow up what was left of Jonathan's empire. It hurt me more than I expected. My ex-fiancé wasn't just a stranger, he was part of the network that was suffocating us. One evening, Jonathan asked me to stay after work. He spoke calmly, but there was weariness in his voice. "If trouble starts, you need to know where to go." He showed me a narrow passageway from the server room to the backyard, almost hidden behind a bookcase. "Arthur knows. No one else. Use it only in an emergency." We stood side by side in the hallway, the lamp casting long shadows on the wall. I could feel his closeness like the warmth of a fireplace. He looked at me for the first time not as an employee. "You're stronger than you think," he said quietly. "And you're kinder than you let on," I replied. I was awakened in the night by a call from a no-number phone. The voice was distorted, but I recognized Stephen's intonation. "Kat," he said, "you don't understand what you're getting yourself into. Get away from him before it's too late. This isn't your war." I was silent. He continued, "If you stay, I won't be able to protect you." And he hung up. I sat in the dark holding the phone in my hands. The server room was noisy behind the wall, and the ocean roared outside the window. I understood that if I left now I would save myself, but I would betray not only Jonathan, but also the person I had finally managed to become. If I stayed, I would become part of a dangerous game. In the morning, the storm washed away part of the shore. The ocean beat against the rocks like drums. Jonathan sat on the terrace, wrapped in a blanket. "It's going to be worse tonight," he said without looking at me. I understood. We both sensed that something big was coming. In the evening, I was checking the windows when I noticed a car without license plates near the gate. The headlights went out, but the dark silhouette remained. There was tension in the air like before a storm. I went back into the house and locked the door. Before going to bed, I watched Jonathan for a long time as he worked intently on his laptop. There was something unbreakable in his face that gave me strength. I felt a bond growing between us that could no longer be broken. It had become something bigger than work, an anchor that kept me here. I lay down in bed and wrote in my notebook, "Today, fear and love go hand in hand." And it seems that the house is breathing with me. Ever since I saw that car without license plates, the house seemed to stop breathing evenly. The silence became thick like the lobby outside a courtroom. I caught myself listening to every rustle, memorizing every corner as if preparing for a survival exam. Jonathan had changed too. He joked less, spent more time poring over documents, and held his phone in his hand more often, as if waiting for bad news. A storm began at night. A real, heavy storm with gusts of wind that tore off pieces of the roof tiles. The waves crashed against the rocks as if trying to climb up to us. The electricity flickered and went out. I grabbed a flashlight and went down to the server room to check the generator. That's what we had agreed on beforehand. The hallway smelled of metal and salt. The door to the server room was ajar. Inside, I saw a man in a hoodie leaning over the rack. My heart was beating so loudly that I was afraid the whole house would hear it. I pressed myself against the wall and clutched my phone. At that moment, I heard the rustle of wheels behind me. Jonathan. He was riding silently, only his breathing betraying his presence. Our eyes met and he nodded slightly. "Stay calm." The stranger turned around and I recognized Stephen. He was holding a flash drive. He looked at me the way he had once in Boston, both imploring and cold. "Step away, Kat," he said. "This isn't yours." I felt something shift inside me. All those years I believed he was my rock and he was part of this network. Jonathan leaned forward. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "Leave what you took. And go." Stephen cursed, stepped back and threw the flash drive on the floor. "You don't understand," he said. "You're going against people who play with lives." He disappeared through the door before I could say anything. When it was over, my hands were shaking. Jonathan rolled closer. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, but the words wouldn't come out. He held out his hand to me, not as a boss but as someone who understood. I took it, and that touch was a lifeline. We went upstairs. The storm raged outside the windows, the house humming like a ship. Arthur had already called the police, but I knew Stephen would get away as he always did. Jonathan sat in the library and I stood next to him, hugging myself. He looked at me for a long time, as if deciding whether he could say what he wanted to say. "I'm used to being betrayed by partners," he finally said. "But the hardest thing is when you're betrayed by those you love." I sat down next to him without thinking, just allowing myself to be there. We were silent. His hand rested on the armrest, mine on my knee, and at some point our fingers touched. It was a quiet, almost accidental movement, but it meant more than any confession could have. That night, when I returned to my room, the storm was beating against the windows, but I felt strangely calm. I felt that something between us had changed, as if the danger outside had only intensified what was growing inside. I remembered how he looked at me, how he squeezed my hand, and it became a warmth deep inside. Before going to sleep, I wrote in my notebook. Today, for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I stood next to him. And I know I'll stay. Not just because of work, but because my heart has already made its choice. The morning after that night was strangely quiet. The ocean looked tired, as if it had grown weary of crashing against the rocks. The house smelled of candle smoke and damp wood. The police cars had already left, leaving behind tire tracks and a brief report that solved nothing. They listened, nodded, asked about the surveillance camera, we didn't have one, and then drove away as if it were a routine incident. I walked around the house and felt the traces of the night's tension lingering in the walls. The server room hummed more evenly, but now I perceived that hum as the heartbeat of our shared secret. Jonathan sat in the library, focused, with the flash drive Stephen had thrown on the floor in front of him. We both understood that this was not the end, but the beginning. I made coffee, brought it to him, and for the first time ever allowed myself to linger nearby. He looked tired, but there was a strange clarity in his face. "Thank you," he said quietly, as if we were talking about something more than just a drink. I sat down opposite him. Between us lay folders like a map of a minefield. We began to sort through the data together. I read letters, sorted transactions, found matches, and he explained the schemes and showed me where to look for dates. I felt like I was entering his world, a world he never let anyone else into. He told me how the partners transferred money, how they created fictitious companies, how Stephen was part of this chain. And the more I heard, the more surprised I was. Sitting next to me was a man who had lived through a whole war, and I had no idea how dirty it was. As we worked, I noticed how our hands sometimes met over a single sheet of paper. At first, we both pretended it was accidental, then we stopped pulling our fingers away. It seemed as if the silence of the library itself approved. Arthur was acting cautiously. He brought us food, closed the doors, checked the gates. His face became harder than before and his movements more careful. I realized that both he and Jonathan were preparing for the enemy's next move. In the afternoon I went out onto the terrace. The ocean was gray and dense and the seagulls flew low. I felt as if I could sense Jonathan's world, endless lines of communication like waves, and among them he himself trying to hold on. Suddenly I felt his gaze. He had approached quietly as always. "You know how to listen to the sea," he said. "I try," I replied. He paused, then added, "I don't remember anyone staying so long without asking for anything in return." In the evening we found ourselves back in the server room. Jonathan showed me a new diagram, how to calculate the key nodes from which the entire network originates. I held the printouts in my hands while he leaned closer to explain. I could feel the warmth of his shoulder, the scent of his perfume, faint but recognizable. His words grew quieter, his movements slower. He looked at me, and in that look there was no boss, only a person who trusted me. When we came out, the house was already plunged into the semi-darkness of night. Arthur was clattering pots and pans somewhere in the kitchen. We stopped at the stairs where a lamp cast a soft light. Jonathan said, "If it gets too dangerous, leave. I don't want you to get hurt." I looked at him and suddenly realized that I wasn't afraid of the threats, but of the thought of leaving. "I'll stay," I said. He didn't argue, just nodded briefly, but there was something in his eyes that was warmer than words. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night. It seemed to me that I was no longer just an assistant but part of this struggle. And that something stronger than fear was developing between Jonathan and me. Trust that was turning into affection. I wrote in my notebook, "After the storm the water is clearer. Maybe people are too." A week had passed since that night, and our house had become more like a headquarters than a refuge. In the mornings I laid out documents on the huge table in the library, and in the evenings Jonathan and I checked transactions, wrote letters, and compiled reports. I learned to look at the numbers through his eyes, to see the people and threats behind them. Each new coincidence in the documents was like a flash of lightning in the night sky. A strange calm grew inside me. I knew that if I had been running from the past before, now I was moving toward something. I was not only helping him, I was helping myself return to life. And more often I caught myself thinking of Jonathan not as my employer. His presence became a habit, his gaze a source of support, his rare smile a reward I did not ask for but lived for. One morning we sat across from each other at a long table. He was showing me a diagram of how their black network pumped money through fictitious funds. His fingers slid across the paper, my hand rested nearby, and I felt the warmth of his skin. Neither of us pulled away. We looked at each other, long without words, and that look was louder than any speech. Our plan began to take shape. We gathered a package of data that could bring down several key players. Jonathan spoke to a journalist he knew before the accident, and I prepared the dossier. We worked as a well-coordinated team. But the closer we got to our goal, the stronger the shadow loomed. A car with no license plates appeared at the gate again, this time during the day. Arthur checked the perimeter cameras. Someone was clearly watching us. The mailbox filled with letters with no return address. "Stop. We know who you are. This is your last chance." I was used to threats on paper, but I felt that something real was behind them. Arthur started carrying an old revolver with him, even though he used to just grumble about drafts. Jonathan started sleeping in the study next to the server room. I slept in the room closest to him. In the evenings when I made tea, he would sit silently, staring at the fire in the fireplace while I stared at his hands. I wanted to touch them, but I was afraid of destroying the fragile balance. One night he asked me to come out onto the terrace. It was calm, the sea was smooth, the stars were like holes punched in the sky with nails. He looked at the horizon and said quietly, "When all this is over, I want to go to the mountains. No security, no phone calls. Just breathe. Will you come with me?" I didn't answer right away. I watched his face soften as he spoke. "If there's somewhere to go, yes," I said. He turned his head, and for the first time, there was no pain or fatigue in his eyes, only a question. The next day what I feared happened. The journalist we were working with stopped responding. His phone was off, his email wasn't answering. Jonathan turned pale when he heard this. "They're moving faster than I thought," he said. Now our flash drive was the only copy. We understood that once we started, there would be no turning back. That evening, I stood at the window of my room and looked down at the road leading to the gate. I heard a sound from below, as if someone had thrown a pebble into the water. I looked closely. There was a man standing behind the trees. He was smoking, and the glowing tip of his cigarette gave away his location. Our eyes met. I felt a chill in my stomach. I closed the curtains and went to Jonathan's office. He was sitting at his laptop, but when he saw my face he understood immediately. "We're in the game now," he said. I moved closer and put my hand on the back of his chair. He looked up, and for the first time ever he didn't look lonely. We both knew that what awaited us was not just a battle for the truth, but a test of our connection. That night I didn't write anything in my notebook. I just lay in bed, feeling the warmth where he had touched my hand. And I understood, I was staying not for the money, not for the debt, for him and for myself, the new me. That evening the air in the house was tense, like a stretched string. The curtains fluttered in the wind, but we had closed the windows beforehand and double-checked the locks. I felt like an actress on stage where the performance was about to begin, but no one knew their lines. Jonathan sat in his office like a stone statue, but his hands were shaking. I could see it. Arthur silently placed small battery-powered lanterns in the corners of the room, like candles in a chapel. By evening we got the signal. Our journalist was in touch. He wrote briefly, "Material ready, need the last part, be careful." We knew that this night was the last before publication. The flash drive was in the safe under our password. I checked it 3 times. Around midnight the light from the sea lights disappeared, as if someone had turned off the lighthouse. The generator hummed but shut down a minute later. The house was plunged into darkness, with only the server room glowing with green dots. I heard footsteps at the front door, heavy and confident. Arthur jumped up like a spring. "They're here," he said quietly. There was a bang in the hallway. I grabbed the flashlight and rushed to Jonathan's office. He was already rolling toward me, his face focused, his eyes icy. "Don't be afraid," he said, but I could see that he himself was afraid. Arthur stood at the entrance, blocking the passage. The door shook from the impact. "The safe," Jonathan said. "Open it." "Are you sure?" "Yes. We'll take the flash drive and go through the passage to the garden." I opened the safe. The flash drive lay there like a drop of light. I squeezed it in my palm, feeling it warm up. Another blow, the door cracked. Arthur raised his revolver. We moved toward the server room, behind which was a hidden passage. I went first, Jonathan followed, the wheels of his chair clattering on the stone. Behind us there was a crash and screams. I felt that everything was being decided at that moment. If we got out we would survive. If not, we would disappear. In the narrow corridor I heard Stephen's voice. "Kat, stop," he shouted. "You don't understand. They'll kill you both." His voice was close. I turned around. A shadow, a silhouette, a hand with a weapon. At that moment, Jonathan abruptly stood between me and the corridor. As far as his wheelchair would allow, he leaned forward, covering me with his shoulder. "Run," he said. "Get out through the passageway." But I couldn't. I grabbed the nearest metal box and hit the light switch with all my strength. The corridor was plunged into darkness. Someone fired a shot. The bullet hit the wall, showering us with crumbs of stone. Arthur shouted something from behind, followed by the sound of another shot and someone cursing. We escaped into the garden through a secret door. The storm was already tearing leaves from the trees. I pushed Jonathan's wheelchair across the wet slabs, barely able to stay on my feet myself. He held the flash drive, pressing it to his chest. "Further down to the beach," he said. "There's an old shed there. Arthur has a car." We descended the narrow path, the wet stones slipping under our feet. My heart was pounding in my ears. All I could hear was the sound of the ocean and his hand squeezing mine. We were like a pair of fugitives, driven by a single storm, outside and inside. Arthur caught up with us at the old shed, covered in mud. "Are you alive?" he asked. "We're alive," I replied. Jonathan was breathing heavily, but his eyes were clear. We got into the car. "Now straight to Camden," he said. "From there, the material will go online." It was dark inside the car, only the headlights cutting through the rain. I could feel his knee touching my thigh. He was sitting closer than before. He looked at me and said quietly, "You could have left. But you stayed." I didn't know how to respond. "I don't know how to abandon those who are struggling," I finally said. He closed his eyes as if those words had lifted some of the weight from him. When we got on the highway, I felt for the first time that I was no longer afraid. I held the flash drive in my hands and knew that this night had changed everything. We were no longer just employer and assistant. We were two people connected not only by danger, but also by the choice to stay together when it would have been easier to leave. We drove along the highway, the wet asphalt reflecting the headlights like liquid glass. Behind us lay the mansion, dark, bearing the marks of a nighttime battle, and ahead of us was Camden, a small port town that was to be our salvation. The car smelled of wet fabric and salt. Arthur drove silently, staring straight ahead, while Jonathan sat next to me, clutching the flash drive to his chest like a heart. The town greeted us with empty streets. It was early dawn, gray-blue, quiet, with the faint silhouettes of boats in the harbor. We drove into the courtyard of an old warehouse that the journalist rented as an office. The door was opened by a woman, short, with tired eyes and a jacket draped over her bare shoulder. "You're right on time," she said, and immediately closed the door behind us. It was warm inside. The smell of coffee, cables on the floor, several laptops, blue router lights. We handed over the flash drive. Jonathan sat down in a chair by the wall. Arthur went to check the car. I stood nearby, feeling the tension that had gripped me all night gradually melt away. The journalist copied the files, occasionally glancing at us. "You've been holding on to this all this time?" she asked. Jonathan nodded. "It'll be online soon. It'll be loud." My fingers were shaking. I wasn't thinking about how loud it would be, but about how it would all finally be over. When she went into the next room, we were left alone. I looked at Jonathan. He was pale and tired, but there was something new in his face, something almost bright. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did," I replied. He held out his hand. I took it, a familiar gesture, but now it was different. I felt not just his fingers, but the warmth that penetrated through the fatigue, fear, and nighttime cold. We were silent. His gaze was soft but not pitying. There was respect in it and something else I was afraid to name. Arthur returned and said that everything was clear and we could rest a little. The journalist brought us coffee. We sat on the sofa, sipping the hot liquid, and for the first time in a long time, I felt lightness instead of anxiety. It seemed that with every breath, pieces of myself were returning. Jonathan suddenly spoke, looking at the floor. "When I got into the accident, I thought it was the end. I lost my company, my friends, my wife, my son. I sat in that house and waited for myself to disappear. And then you came." He looked up. "You awakened everything that was still alive in me." I didn't know what to say. The words were stuck somewhere between my throat and my heart. I just put my hand on his palm. He turned it over and squeezed my fingers as if he was afraid to let go. We sat like that for a long time until the dawn outside the window grew brighter. At that moment I realized that everything had changed. There was no longer a wall of roles and positions between us. There was trust tested by fear and an attraction that I could no longer deny. When we left the warehouse, the sun was rising over the harbor. The masts of the boats glistened with raindrops. Jonathan was breathing more deeply, his eyes had softened. He turned to me. "You could leave after tonight. You're free to go." I shook my head. "I don't want to." We walked slowly to the car, his hand still holding mine. At that moment, the sound of the ocean sounded like applause. I felt that this chapter was over, but a new one was ahead. More difficult, but ours. A day after handing over the flash drive, the world around us changed. The morning began with headlines: financial network exposed, top managers under investigation, corporate cartel uncovered. I held my phone in my hands as the news poured in. Jonathan sat in the chair opposite me, his eyes tired but calm. He barely blinked as he stared at the screen. Camden became noisy. Cameras, press cars, and unfamiliar people with laptops were stationed outside the warehouse. We only went out early in the morning to buy coffee and came right back. Arthur checked the doors every half hour. The city, which had seemed like salvation, became a cage. I understood that publication was not the end, but the beginning of a new battle. Those we had hurt were not going to give up. We received threatening letters, silent phone calls, hints in the news. Jonathan didn't say much, but I could see how tense he was. Inside me, another process was taking place. I felt that everything we had been through had brought us closer together than anyone could have imagined. In the evenings, we would sit in a small room with old armchairs and listen to the noise of the port. Sometimes he would talk about his son and how much he missed him. I would talk about my dreams before Stephen, about how I wanted to write a book. These were quiet conversations, but something more was born from them. One night, when we were alone, Jonathan said, I thought I would never trust anyone again." He looked at the floor but his voice trembled. "And I thought I would never love again," I replied almost in a whisper. We both fell silent. Outside, a fishing boat hummed. He looked up and I saw gratitude, pain and tenderness in his eyes. He reached out his hand and I put mine in it. We didn't say a word, but that touch became a starting point, not as a random spark but as a promise made without vows. It seemed to me that it had become lighter outside, even though the night was not yet over. The next day we drove to the outskirts of town, to a small house that Arthur had rented just in case. It was like a hideout, peeling walls, the smell of pine resin, an old sofa. But it was there that we felt truly free for the first time. Jonathan sat by the window and I sat on the floor next to his chair, resting my head on his knee. He gently touched my hair. I realized that over the past few weeks, we had gone from being casual allies to something more. We had saved each other, each in our own way. And now that the publication had come out, all that was left for us to do was to move on, but to live differently. Before going to sleep, I wrote in my notebook, "After an explosion there is always silence. And in that silence we can finally hear ourselves." The first few days after publication seemed quiet, but soon the response came. The shares of the companies mentioned in the investigation plummeted, and alternative versions began to appear in the news. That Jonathan himself had staged a conspiracy, that I was his accomplice. Our photo from the surveillance cameras ended up online. Under the picture someone wrote, "A couple of scammers from Maine." I read it and felt a cold wave rise in my chest. Arthur was on guard. He said we were being followed, either by private investigators or by the very people who had lost their money. He installed a new line of communication, closed off access to the server room, and moved us to a house with armored windows. Jonathan remained calm, but I could see his lips tighten as he read yet another leak. One evening we returned from a short walk to the ocean and found the house open. The kitchen door was ajar and it was quiet inside. I felt the blood drain from my face. Jonathan stopped the stroller and gestured for me to stay put. Arthur disappeared around the corner to check the rooms. We waited as if in slow motion. Suddenly the phone vibrated on the table. The message read, "Give us the original. This is your last chance." Below it was a photo taken that morning as we walked along the promenade. I realized they were very close. At night, the three of us sat in the small living room with the lights off. I held Jonathan's hand not out of pity, but to remind myself that we were alive. He leaned over and whispered, "I don't want you to pay for my fight. I chose this myself," I replied. Towards morning we heard the sound of a car outside the gate. I looked out and saw two black figures in hoodies at the entrance. My heart was in my throat. Arthur raised his revolver. Jonathan grabbed the flash drive. "Now," he said, "everything will be decided." They tried to break down the door, but Arthur's system worked. A spotlight turned on and a siren wailed so loudly that birds flew up from the trees. The figures rushed back to the car and disappeared. We stood in the hallway staring at the spotlight. I held the flash drive in my hands and it felt as heavy as a rock. At that moment I realized that the end was near. Either they would break us or we would survive this too. Jonathan looked at me, his face stern but his gaze warm. "I was afraid of being alone," he said. "You're not alone now," I replied. Later, when dawn broke, we went out onto the terrace. The air was fresh after the night rain. He turned to me and for the first time ever, I saw in his eyes not only fatigue, but also what can come after fear. He took my hand and said, "Whatever happens, I'm glad you're here." I leaned against his shoulder. The ocean roared below as if agreeing with us. I felt that this was the moment when we had finally chosen each other, even if the whole world was against us. A month after that night, the world around me had changed. The publication had triggered an avalanche of consequences. Arrests, interrogations, resignations. The most prominent names, which no one had dared to touch before, were now in the headlines with the prefix former. Financial experts spoke of a new era of transparency. Journalists wrote about the courage of anonymous witnesses, and I just looked at the news and couldn't believe that all this was part of my life. Jonathan gradually regained his reputation. His son Danny came to visit us. First for a day, then stayed for a week. They talked a lot by the fireplace and walked along the ocean for hours. I saw Jonathan's armor melt away, how he became not only a businessman again but also a father. Arthur still grumbled about the drafts, but he smiled more often than before. The house on the cliff was no longer a fortress. It became a home. Jonathan and I officially stopped hiding our relationship. At first it was quiet, touches, glances, nighttime conversations. Then he said, "I don't want to live behind a wall anymore." And I felt the last barrier inside me break down. Now I could freely rest my head on his shoulder while sitting on the terrace, watch Danny throw stones into the water and not be afraid of cameras or whispers. Sometimes in the morning I would wake up before him and watch the light glide across his face. He still looked tired, but there was life in that face. I remembered how we met. Me, a broken bride, him, a paralyzed tycoon. And I smiled. We had both been thrown overboard and we had learned to swim together. One evening the three of us sat by the fireplace. Danny talked about college. Arthur quietly twirled his old pipe in his hands. Jonathan turned to me and said, "When it all started, I thought this story was the end. But you made it the beginning." I felt warmth rising in my throat. "And you made my life the beginning," I replied. Outside the ocean was calm. The lights of fishing boats twinkled on the horizon. I went out onto the balcony and Jonathan followed. We stood side by side and I felt his hand in mine. The world no longer seemed like a prison. We had defeated not only our enemies but also our own fear. I wrote the last entry in my notebook. "The storm has passed. We remain. We are a story that no one can rewrite." And I closed it. Now we could move on with our lives. Not as fugitives, not as witnesses, but as people who had built their home after the storm. The ocean roared softly as if congratulating us. Jonathan leaned toward me, and his lips held a promise that needed no words. I knew there would be new days ahead, new projects, new challenges. But the main thing was that we were now together. The house on the cliff, which once seemed like a cage, became our beginning. And as the lights went out outside the windows, I held his hand, and for the first time in a long time I was sure. This is the end of the old story and the beginning of a new one, where we are no longer abandoned, we choose for ourselves.